Christmas is filled with all sorts of fun festivities and controversy. Every year when the season of Christmas rolls around, we end up with all sorts of questions and debates such as, when does the season of Christmas start? When does it end? Why do we celebrate on December 25th? And how did St. Nicholas go from someone who punched heretics in the face and busted serial killers to the Santa Claus in a soda ad? Well, lots of different questions, lots of different answers. So one of the biggest ones is, why do we celebrate on December 25th in the first place? Most people are going to say something along the lines of, the Christians were trying to baptize a pagan holiday. They were trying to keep Christians away from pagans, but also trying to bring pagans into the Christian faith by celebrating on the same day as a pagan holiday. Well, let's look into this a little bit. The first holiday that people like to claim is being baptized by the Christians is the winter solstice, which we will talk about, but in a little bit. The first one I want to get to is the one that actually inspired this myth about the date of Christmas, which is the celebration of Sol Invictus. So the celebration of Sol Invictus was instituted by the Romans in around 270 to 275 AD. Pretty early time in the Christian church. Well, the first writings that indicate that Christmas, the celebration of the birth of our Lord, is being celebrated on December 25th, are actually dated in around 204 AD from Hippolytus of Rome. So technically, the Christians were celebrating Christmas on December 25th, about 70 years before the pagans instituted their own holiday. And in fact, that holiday from the pagans was instituted to combat the Christian holiday in the area. Now we're going to go back to the question of the winter solstice. Many people, like my former self, like to state that the winter solstice was being celebrated and then the Christians decided to celebrate Christmas on that day to help bring pagans into the Christian community. Well, we'll take a look at the scriptures to see how Christians came up with December 25th. So it starts with St. John the Baptist. St. John the Baptist was conceived when an angel appeared in a vision to his father, St. Zechariah. So St. Zechariah, he was a priest. And on this day of the vision, the scriptures note, according to the custom of the priesthood, it fell to him by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense. So this day was Yom Kippur. This is the Day of Atonement, the day that the priest would go into the temple and burn incense after casting lots to determine who it was that would go in there. And this date was the end of September. We know St. John the Baptist was conceived towards the end of September. This comes into play with the birth of Jesus because when the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary for the annunciation of the conception of Jesus Christ, he concluded by telling her, and behold, your kinswoman Elizabeth in her old age has also conceived a son, and this is the 6th month with her who was called barren. So with St. John the Baptist being conceived in late September, that would place his birth date 9 months later in late June. Jesus was conceived 6 months after the conception of John the Baptist, which means that Jesus' birthday would be towards the end of December. So that's how we get to the latter half of December for Jesus' birthday. Well, how did we get to the 25th? This goes back to a traditional Jewish belief that the creation of the universe was on March 25th. And this goes back to the early Christians who shared that belief and believed that Jesus Christ was crucified on March 25th, and he was crucified during the Feast of the Passover. This is pertinent for creation in Jesus Christ because we can see that Jesus was conceived around late March, which with March 25th being recognized as the creation of the universe, that would be a big deal for God incarnate, God made man in the womb of the Virgin Mary. And then March 25th for Jesus' crucifixion is pertinent to the date of creation because it is then the date of the new creation when Jesus was crucified and the world was baptized by his blood as the new creation. So this all comes into play with the winter solstice when St. Mede in around the 700s was reflecting on the dates of John the Baptist and Jesus Christ. And he was reflecting on a scripture verse from the Gospel according to John the Evangelist, particularly about a certain scripture verse where John the Baptist says, "This joy of mine is now full. He must increase, but I must decrease." And John the Baptist was saying that he himself must decrease so that Jesus Christ can increase. So this plays into the winter solstice and the summer solstice because John the Baptist, born on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year with the most light, where light now starts to decrease until we get to the winter solstice where light now increases. So the Christmas holiday wasn't established on December 25th for the winter solstice. Instead, it was through divine providence that it aligned with the winter solstice. And some people will still object, despite all this, that we don't know the actual birth date of Jesus Christ. And that is actually very correct. We do not know definitively that he was born on December 25th. However, referring to the scriptures in both Jewish and Christian traditions, everything aligns in a very providential way to where December 25th makes the most sense and is probably pretty darn accurate, all things considered. And many people like to use these misconceptions about the date of Christmas to cite it as some sort of fake holiday that debunks the rest of Christianity so they don't need to partake in Christianity. However, this couldn't be farther from the truth. The Christmas holiday had nothing to do with the pagan holiday until the pagans wanted to try and take the date back to themselves. Ultimately, it's always been a Christian holiday and always will be. So now that we've talked about the date of Christmas, now we can discuss and debate, when does the season of Christmas start? Well, I've got a pretty unpopular opinion. Many like to say that it starts after Halloween or after Thanksgiving. Well, actually, based on the liturgical calendar of the Catholic Church founded by Jesus Christ, the Christmas season starts on December 25th and is followed by the octave, which are 8 days of celebration, where it's 8 days of Christmas. And on that 8th day, we celebrate Mary as Holy Mother of God, a title given to her in 431 AD in the Council of Ephesus to recognize that Jesus Christ was the divine being from the moment of conception in her womb, making her the Holy Mother of God to glorify Jesus Christ even more. And then that leads us into the 12 days of Christmas. Believe it or not, they're actually not about shopping and holiday deals. They're actually about Christmas. The 12 days of Christmas actually connect Christmas to the day of Epiphany, which is when God revealed himself to the Gentiles through the 3 Magi, the kings, who traveled east to Bethlehem to visit the Christ child. And then the season of Christmas officially ends on the Sunday after Epiphany, which is the celebration of the baptism of Jesus Christ. But I will say, despite all the debates, if you guys want to put your Christmas holidays up early to celebrate the glory of the Lord for even longer and earlier, by all means, feel free to go ahead. I love it. Another question, what does the name Christmas mean? Well, it's actually 2 words combined together, Christ and Mass. It's Christ's Mass, where we celebrate Christ in the Mass and his incarnation. And there are many different ways to spread Christmas cheer while keeping Christ in Christmas. So you can say Merry Christmas, or you can say Merry Xmas. Where did Xmas come from? The X is actually an abbreviation of the Greek word for Christ, which starts with an X. So when people write or say Merry Xmas, they're still celebrating Christ within Christmas. It's a beautiful thing. Another way to spread the light of Christ during the Christmas season is to say Happy Holidays, because holidays comes from holy days. Holy days are from the liturgical calendar of the Catholic Church. So whenever we say Merry Christmas, Merry Xmas, or Happy Holidays, we are celebrating the true roots of the Christmas traditions. And that is just such a beautiful thing in my eyes. I just love it. There's so many ways to say Merry Christmas while keeping Christ in Christmas. All right, so we've talked about the biggest guy of them all, Jesus Christ. Well, the next big guy in Christmas is Santa Claus. How did St. Nicholas become Santa Claus? Well, who is St. Nicholas? He was born towards the end of the 3rd century in Turkey. He was orphaned at a young age and gave all his inheritance to the needy and the poor. He was ordained as a priest by his uncle and ended up becoming a bishop. At one point, St. Nicholas was exiled and imprisoned under Emperor Diocletian during a pretty heavy persecution in early church history. But he was freed just in time to go to the Council of Nicaea, where a heretic, Arius, attended as well. St. Nicholas had a very strong feeling towards Arius. He was very passionate, and his passions got a hold of him, and well, he punched Arius across the face for his heretical views that he wouldn't give up. And St. Nicholas did state that he regretted letting these emotions grab hold of him so strongly. Speaking for myself, and I'm sure many other sinners, I personally understand the inspirations that led to that very emotional moment with Arius. But St. Nicholas was a very nice man that loved his enemies. As I said earlier about how St. Nicholas spent his inheritance for the needy, he was very passionate about helping the poor and the needy. At one point, he heard about a father with 3 daughters that were in quite a predicament. The father was poor and the daughters had no dowry, which meant that the daughters were likely to be unwed. So the father planned to sell them into prostitution. When St. Nicholas heard this, he couldn't just sit by. So there's a few different accounts as to how this unfolded. One of them holds that St. Nicholas went by night and saw their window open and threw in a bag of coins into the window. He learned that that bag of coins was used to help the eldest daughter with her dowry and to become married, which brought great delight to St. Nicholas. So he planned to go again for the second daughter, which was another successful effort. And after learning about the success, he wanted to do the same for the third daughter. Well, the father was waiting for him, hidden in the night, and when he saw St. Nicholas, he kissed his feet and thanked him so much for helping him and his family from avoiding such deep sin. Another great story of St. Nicholas is how he confronted a murderer. So it starts with 3 children who were working in their field late at night. After it started to get dark, they wanted to get to shelter, and they saw a house nearby. It was a butcher shop, because people worked out of their houses, literally worked from home before it was cool. So the children went to the house and asked the butcher if they could stay the night. He graciously welcomed them in, and then he decided to murder them. He put their bodies in salt tubs, something that the butchers had to preserve meats. Well, fast forward about 7 years, I guess he didn't do anything with those bodies. St. Nicholas, again, who was a bishop and was well known to the community as a bishop, stopped in the butcher shop. And the butcher said, "Oh, are you here as a customer? How can I help you?" And St. Nicholas said, "I want what's in those salt tubs." Well, the butcher hightailed it right on out of there because he knew that St. Nicholas knew something that he didn't want him to know. So St. Nicholas went over to the salt tubs, opened them up, saw the bodies, and raised the children back to life. So St. Nicholas lived a very saintly life and died on December 6th in the year 343 in Myra. His tomb soon became a place of pilgrimage, with his relics, his remains, being considered miraculous. There was a mysterious liquid flowing from his relics called the manna of St. Nicholas. This mysterious liquid, which is still produced today, actually has a lot of miracles attested to it, particularly for people being healed if they come into contact with the fluid. So how did this gentleman, St. Nicholas, become Santa Claus? On the feast day of St. Nicholas, December 6th, people would give gifts to their children or other children in honor of St. Nicholas on his feast day. This, naturally, as you know, got moved to December 25th through a long series of events. So a lot of the folklore of St. Nicholas started in the 17th century with the Dutch. The Dutch name for St. Nicholas was Sint Nicolaas, which was shortened to Sinterklaas, which would be turned into Santa Claus by us Americans who have a hard time with words and come up with stuff. So Sinterklaas was pictured very similar to St. Nicholas, who was a bishop. He was pictured with the mitre hat, the bishop's alb, and the crozier. Some of the traditional folklore of Sinterklaas was that he kept track of who was naughty and nice. The naughty received punishments and the nice received gifts. The children had a tradition to leave their shoes out on December 5th, and then in the morning of December 6th, there'd be a small gift there from Sinterklaas. The folklore also held that Sinterklaas had a white horse that he rode, which, as you could see, would pave the way for reindeer. Well, when the Americas were being colonized, they weren't really getting a lot of Catholic tradition because the Protestants were coming over first. Well, the Dutch colonized some point after them and brought their Catholic holidays and their traditions. We see in newspapers dated around 1773 and 1774 reports of Dutch families beginning to celebrate Christmas with Sinterklaas. And around 1804, Sinterklaas was starting to be popularized in the Americas, with a gentleman making woodcuts of Sinterklaas, and it had images of stockings near fire in the background, and gifts, and all the other traditions that we're used to seeing. And then in 1809, Washington Irving really contributed from the conversion from Sinterklaas to Santa Claus by coming up with a lot of the descriptions that turned into Santa Claus today. And then in the 1820s, we see Sinterklaas starting to rise in popular American culture, with stores using his images in their advertisements. And then by the 1840s, newspapers started putting Santa Claus in their ads, which would attract children, which would attract parents, which would attract spending. And then in the 1890s, the Salvation Army introduced their famous version of Santa Claus as he asked for donations on the street corners. And then Coca-Cola, the soda company, came in to really seal the deal on Santa Claus. From 1931 to 1964, they ran a very heavy ad campaign during each winter, which was their slowest time of year. They incorporated Santa Claus as the jolly guy we know now throughout their ads in a heavy campaign that basically cemented Santa Claus into American culture in the way we know today. Coca-Cola didn't invent Santa Claus, but they did draw from all sorts of inspirations from the various traditions that turned St. Nicholas into Santa Claus that we know today. And in addition to Santa Claus, there's all sorts of Christmas traditions that we're so familiar with that have their own stories. So the biggest one that we know is Christmas trees. So Christmas trees have a variety of origin stories. Germany is one of the biggest ones. In the 8th century, St. Boniface traveled from England to Germany to check on the Germans who had previously converted. Much to his dismay, he saw that the Germans had reverted back to paganism. What he witnessed was a bunch of Germans worshiping a big oak tree. They called this tree the Tree of Thor, one of their gods. And the biggest horror came that he saw a gentleman that was about to be sacrificed to the tree, human sacrifice to the Tree of Thor. Well, he wasn't going to put up with this, so he went and got an axe and chopped down the big oak tree. This horrified the people that had reverted back to paganism. Some of them even prayed to Thor to punish Boniface. Well, nothing happened because St. Boniface was a man of Christ and Christ is king. But after the tree fell, they discovered an evergreen tree growing up under it. It was more than just a little sapling, it was enough to have a point to it. And somehow this tree miraculously survived the fall of this gigantic oak tree. Well, Boniface saw this tree and was worried that the locals were actually going to worship this tree, so he decided to use it as a teaching opportunity to bring them back to Christ. He showed them how the tree was pointed, pointing up towards heaven, the kingdom of Christ, and he also taught them about how the tree was an evergreen, as in always green no matter the season, just like we can have eternal life through Jesus Christ. So after this teaching moment, he instructed these new faithful to go and harvest some of the evergreen trees around and take them into their homes to then spread the light of Christ to others and spreading the story of Christ. And much of the decoration used led to what we have today for decoration. They used candles, which represented the flame of Christ, which have now become Christmas lights. And they also hung wafers from the tree representing the Eucharist. Those wafers end up turning into cookies and then turn into ornaments that we have today. Another origin story about Christmas trees goes back to the late Middle Ages. Catholics would celebrate during the Christmas season with what's called a creation play. They would walk through the lineage of Christ starting from the moment of creation with Adam and Eve. Well, Adam and Eve were in the garden, which had a tree. And for this play, they wanted a tree, but it was in the middle of winter. The only trees that were a viable option were evergreen trees. So they would bring a tree into the play and they would hang fruit from it to represent the fruit of temptation. Well, after Protestants started taking public office, they came down on the Catholics and no longer allowed for this public play. But Catholics weren't going to let the show not go on, so they brought these trees into their homes. So it became a home tradition to have Christmas trees. So while some people consider Christmas trees to have pagan origins, they are anything but pagan and are very Christian and a beautiful way to glorify God during the Advent and Christmas season. Another popular tradition is tinsel, typically decorated on a Christmas tree. So the story of tinsel starts with the Holy Family going into Egypt to flee from Herod, who was trying to kill the Christ child. The story goes that the Holy Family one night sought refuge in a cave. Well, that night, a spider actually wove a web over the cave entrance. When Herod's soldiers went to that area seeking out any families that might have been hiding from his decree, they saw that cave and they were about to go in. But one of them said, "No, look at all those webs. No one's been in there for a long time, so don't even waste your time." So because of that, the soldiers left the area and didn't find the Holy Family. Well, it became tinsel when the next morning the Holy Family awoke and the web had developed hoarfrost overnight due to the cold conditions. And when the family was pulling the webs off, it was coming off like tinsel. So that's the tradition of tinsel. Then we move on to the tradition of stockings. How did we get to hanging those over the mantle and putting gifts in them? Well, that goes back to St. Nicholas. There's a few different options for the stories, but one of the most popular stories is that the family that had the 3 daughters that needed a dowry had just done the laundry and hung their stockings out the window to dry. Well, St. Nicholas passing by put coins in their stockings. Hence why we put stockings up and we put gifts in there for the kids and other family members. And then the sugary candy canes that kids like to suck on and sharpen and then poke each other with like they're swords. Those actually come from St. Nicholas as well, because when he was a bishop, he had the crozier, which resembled a cane. So even candy canes have very Christian roots. Then we move on to Christmas lights. Why is it that we ended up with Christmas lights on our houses? Well, we go back to 1882, 3 years after Thomas Edison released his invention of the light bulb. Well, a gentleman named Edward Johnson took it upon himself to make a strand of colored lights. And he hung these lights in his parlor window to show them to others so that they could see them and enjoy them during the Christmas season. Seeing as these were outrageously expensive because it was a very new invention for the time, they really didn't take hold in popular culture until 1932 when mass production helped to make these Christmas lights more available to the average consumer, becoming a Christmas tradition. In conclusion, there are many different traditions throughout the Christmas season. Some people like to say they're pagan, some like to say they're not Christian, etc., etc. Many of these traditions have very Christian roots and are a great way to celebrate Jesus Christ during the season of Advent and Christmas. It's always great to remember that Advent is a time of preparation, and then Christmas, which comes at December 25th, is a time for loving celebration. We don't want to Christmas ourselves out during Advent, and we actually want to cultivate fruit during Advent that can be harvested during the celebrations of Christmas, which is a beautiful time to welcome Jesus Christ into our hearts and into our families. And I hope that you too will partake in a lot of the different festivities in a loving and spiritually developing way during the Advent and Christmas season to help glorify God and bring Christ to others. And I pray that you will have a very Merry Christmas and a happy Advent season.